We are super excited to have you all with us, and we know that this is kind of an unprecedented clubs night, but I actually think it will allow us to connect more and to connect in more creative ways. So without further ado, turn the time over to Brady to introduce our speaker and the real reason you came tonight, Professor Clark.
Great, thanks Rachel, and thanks everyone for coming. We have been really excited about planning this, and again, just really grateful for the opportunity to have a forum to discuss these issues and to be able to share more with the students here at BYU and others about freedom of religion or belief. And I have the privilege to be able to introduce and kind of facilitate our discussion this evening with Professor Elizabeth Clark, who we're so grateful to have with us. A brief introduction, if that is possible. I'll give a Professor Clark. Elizabeth Clark is an associate director for the International Center for Law and Religion Studies, and it's a position that she has held since 2000, when the center was first founded by Professor Cole Durham. She graduated from BYU with degrees in comparative literature and Russian. She then attended BYU's J. Reuben Clark Law School, where she earned her Juris Doctorate with high honors. Upon her law school graduation, she spent 2 years as a clerk to Judge J. Clifford Wallace, a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. After doing appellate litigation and practice for 2 years in Washington, D.C., she returned to Provo to help start the International Center for Law and Religion Studies and joined the BYU Law faculty. Now, I'm not sure if it's possible to fully capture all that has progressed in those 20 years that Professor Clark has been at the center, but just to give you an idea of some of the things that she's done in that time. She's organized and spoken at over 75 academic conferences in the US and abroad, and also has organized many of those conferences, particularly one here at BYU that's been going for over 25 years now, the Law and Religion Symposium. She has analyzed legislation and draft legislation on religion for the US State Department, USAID, the OSCE, and international NGOs. She's been the primary author of multiple US Supreme Court amicus briefs and expert testimony for the Indonesian Constitutional Court. And she has also testified before the US Congress, as well as the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. And on top of all that, Professor Clark also speaks 4 different languages: Czech, Russian, German, and French, if I got all of those, I think. So we are just so delighted to have you here, Professor Clark, and so grateful for, obviously with all that you do, for your generous offering of your time and insights tonight.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the very generous introduction. And thank you, Rachel, Anna, Brady, for putting this all together. I'm really impressed with all of you and delighted to be here tonight.
Thank you. I think Professor Clark, if it works for you, we'll plan to go for about 20 to 30 minutes, try and cover some questions that we've come up with and thought would be of general interest. And then for whatever time we have remaining, until about just before 8 o'clock, we'll take some questions from people who are attending.
That sounds great.
Great. Well, I think one thing that I definitely have wondered before, and I think a lot of people are probably wondering, is how did you first get involved in this issue? How did you first come across religious freedom?
You know, I first probably ran across it when I studied Russian back in the era of the Soviet Union. And so studying that, I spent some time in the Soviet Union as an undergrad, and then things opened up and I spent time in Czechoslovakia as a missionary and teaching English there as well. And that was a fascinating opportunity to see firsthand what people's lives are like when they don't have basic freedoms like freedom of religion.
Yeah, I love the connection, because I think a lot of people who are at BYU who have been on a mission, definitely that's an experience that can really change your worldview and shape a lot of what follows in your life. And as a part of, I guess, like kind of your development in learning about these issues, what do you feel like has been what has it been like to have a career that's been focused on that? I'm guessing that you probably didn't know exactly what that would look like, especially as a missionary, but how has that been in having a career where kind of what you do centers on this issue?
You know, it's been an enormous blessing. I've been so grateful. It's been one of those things where you try to do the best you can with your life and turn it over to the Lord, and he finds ways to do more with your life than you ever thought you could. Because I didn't know the field existed. It was the academic study of international law and religion issues was pretty much non-existent when I was a student. When I felt prompted to go to law school, I went to law school. I really enjoyed it, but it was sort of like, okay, Lord, I'm here. What am I doing? And so I went and I practiced law for a few years. But when I was a law student, I had an opportunity to be involved with a professor who had been doing some work on this field, Cole Durham, and I just loved it. It was fascinating. You could really see where academic talents, things that you spent years learning how to do, learning languages, learning how to analyze text, learning about world politics, all come together in a way that makes a real difference for real people. And I love that.
It's very evident in just even hearing you talk about it. That's wonderful. What would you say has been like an area that you've particularly enjoyed researching? Obviously, like you said, there's so many different like disciplines that cross roads in religious freedom and so many different areas of religious freedom. But what do you feel like has been a particular favorite of yours?
Well, and that's one thing I love about it, is that it is such an interdisciplinary field. I work with people from all faiths around the world, but people from all disciplines as well. People who are political scientists, people who are sociologists, people who do religious studies. And so it's fun for me to be able to sort of pull together in an interdisciplinary way. In my own research, probably two areas I've really enjoyed is looking at post-communist Europe, just because I have a personal interest, and also looking at the rights of religious organizations. That's called autonomy, sort of their right to be able to function and what allows them to function, to choose their own leadership, to pick their own doctrine, sort of core things that are a question of freedom of religion or belief.
Great. That's great. And I appreciate you giving us some of the background about you and about why you're motivated for this, because I think that'll really help now as we kind of shift to talking about understanding what freedom of religion or belief really is. And that's kind of the next question I want to ask is, how would you define freedom of religion or belief? What does that term entail?
Yeah. That's the full term that's used in most international agreements, and it's used for a reason. It's because it not only, we often think of freedom of religion as the right to worship. I've heard people say, well, my freedom of religion isn't being impacted. Look, I can go to church, although you can't now, I suppose. But the question is what is freedom of religion? It's a lot more than that. It's the freedom to be able to make a choice about whether you have a religion or a conscientious belief, or you choose not to. That's part of the freedom of religion as well. It's for people who don't believe. But it's more than just the belief side of it. It's also the ability to act on it, particularly in ways that don't cause significant harm to other people. It's not unlimited. Some people like to argue against straw men, and they'll say, oh, freedom of, religious freedom, that's ridiculous. If you had all full religious freedom, then you could do anything and you could kill your children. And, yes, there is Abraham and Isaac, but the truth is, under any legal regime that exists today, Abraham wouldn't be able to claim religious freedom for the right to sacrifice his son, because there are limits to what is permitted.
Right.
Sorry.
No, that's great. I appreciate that, because I think in trying to define that term, you do have to talk about what isn't freedom of religion in order to also kind of understand what it is.
Right. Well, and so for so many people, they think about it, and the stereotype right now is, oh, that's just a term that's being pulled out by the religious right to hide bigotry of LGBTQ individuals. And the truth is, this is a term and a concept that goes far beyond that. And although there may be, and there are people out there who are bigoted, I think trying to say that that's all this is missing a huge picture.
Right. And I appreciate you bringing that up. That was actually going to be my next question, is how do you see religious freedom relating to other rights that that we have in society and that are important, and how what's the relationship there between those?
Right, and it comes with other rights. And sometimes there's tensions between religious freedom and other rights. What's really interesting, though, is that I didn't think I realized when I started this, is how bundled rights are. That's sort of the term that's used by Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winning economist, and others. Research that's been done has shown that countries that protect religious freedom are also it's highly correlated with countries that protect other civil rights, protect women's rights, that have a stronger democracy, are less likely to engage in wars. I mean, it's a real lot of interesting some economic rights as well, that they tend to come together. And even sort of in the United States, there's often this cultural war concept of religious freedom and LGBTQ rights, but the studies show that countries that protect religious freedom are also the countries that protect LGBTQ rights. So it's actually not, as a practical matter, as much of a contradiction as people think it is. But sometimes rights do come in tension. I mean, there are, concerns about, whenever there's a legitimate government interest, there'll sometimes be tensions between more than one right. Right to free speech, but that doesn't give you the right to scream fire in a crowded theater. That's the example that comes from an old legal case. So just because you have the right to religious freedom doesn't mean that sometimes that needs to be balanced and weighed against other rights that people have, or other important government interests, like security or public health in this case.
Yeah, definitely very relevant to right now. So I guess in light of that tension that does come up, of course, there's, like you talked about, rights oftentimes are bundled, but when you do have those tensions, what are ways that you've seen that either scholars, judges, or even just your everyday citizen go about resolving tensions? What are things that you've seen that have been important factors to consider, or ways that people have tried to resolve these tensions?
Sure. Sometimes people just, use the concept of, let me just erase the side I don't agree with. And you'll see that on both sides, right? I mean, there's a great article and book by the Hafens about ambiguity and how people sometimes want to just erase the side that's causing tension for their beliefs instead of trying to reconcile and understand it. But there's a couple different ways that different courts and systems use. Sometimes they look at, like a European approach is to look at proportionality, right? You can have limits on religion, but are those really proportionate? Or is this a way out, it's a government outreach? They're saying they're doing it for security. Like there's a US case, it's a great example, right? A prisoner wanted, in a federal penitentiary, who's Muslim, wanted to have a beard. And the prison said, no, you can't have a beard. We need prison security. You could be hiding something in your beard. And he's like, no, I want like a 1/4 of an inch beard. I can't hide anything in a 1/4 of an inch beard. And they said, well, we don't care. It's security, right? And so when it got all the way to the Supreme Court says, in the US, so we don't use the term proportionality. We use this balancing test of, is there a compelling governmental interest? And is it narrowly tailored? And the government said, oh yeah, sure. Security is a compelling government interest. We need our prisons to be secure. But that's not narrowly tailored in this instance, because there's no security problems that can come from a 1/4 inch beard. And so that's the kind of weighing that tends to happen in these cases. It's sort of nuanced, the kinds of things that maybe only a lawyer would love, but there is a balance there. I think that's the important thing to be able to remember.
No, that's great. Thank you for bringing that up. To follow up on that, what would you say how does that apply to kind of the current situation that we're in with the COVID-19 pandemic? Obviously, that's affected a lot of religious worship and the way that religion is functioning right now. And how do you think that relates to this framework that you're talking about?
Sure. I mean, I think this is a great example of trying to use this framework and work it through. Is there a pressing governmental interest? Of course, there's a pressing governmental interest. I think that when you have a worldwide pandemic and millions who've died and infected worldwide, that's there. And then the question becomes a more nuanced one of proportionality. US courts so far have been willing to give the government the benefit of the doubt. You know, they say, well, okay, the science wasn't that good. But when science gets better and people know more, if government restrictions are seen as disproportionate, or that if they are targeting religion, you know, they'll let everyone else meet except religious groups, then that's something that courts tend to look at and say, that's a problem.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's important to remember, especially right now. It can feel like everything is just kind of just happening ad hoc, and that like these decisions, it's hard to know where these decisions are coming from without a reference framework like you were explaining to kind of use. And I think that can help to better interpret how this tension is being worked out. So to maybe shift a little bit, obviously you've done a lot of work internationally, and you've worked with a lot of countries, NGOs in an international context. How, I guess right now, let's start with like, when it comes to international religious freedom, what do you think are some of the compelling interests or compelling issues?
No, I've infected your brain. Sorry.
Can only think about that now. What do you feel like are some of the compelling issues and trends that you feel like are most important for people to know that are happening right now?
Mm-hmm. I think there's been, there's also all the COVID issues, but I think that we've already sort of addressed those. But I think some other major issues that you're seeing worldwide are problems from sort of nationalistic or authoritarian leaders, where there's been some interesting research done that authoritarian leaders in a country with a religious majority will say Russia, that's the country I study, right? There's a dominant religion, authoritarian leader, that they tend to see discriminatory support of the majority religion as a way to shore up their soft power. So you see that going on in different parts of the world, where this kind of nationalism, autarky kind of push comes with demonizing minority groups. You see impulses towards that even in countries that aren't authoritarian, but where you have leaders that are inclined more to that direction, say. That minority groups tend to be marginalized, tend to be painted as the problems for society. It's the sort of the kind of, it's concerning because it's the kind of thing that happened in Germany in the 1930s. In Europe, really, at that time. So that's one set of problems. Another set of problems comes from security concerns. I mean, this has gone back since probably 9/11 really is when it's been front and center on the world stage, but the perception by some governments that religion is necessarily in tension with protecting security. So I work a lot right now in Central Asia, sort of Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, that kind of area. And a number of governments will say, you're wearing a beard, you're too Muslim, let's throw you in jail. We need to protect our security from radical Islamic terrorists, and you are it because you have an Islamic looking beard. Right? That's clearly disproportionate. And so there's the whole set of, you see that in China with the Uyghur Muslims, that part of the reason that China has targeted them is they've been concerned about violent extremism, particularly that associated with Islam. And so they take their largest Muslim minority and have been putting them in re-education camps. It's horrible. It's really horrific. So those are some of the big issues that are going on right now. There's other countries and other concerns, but I think those are some of the big ones.
Yeah, I think you've touched on a lot of really definitely very timely and important issues. And I guess looking at kind of the international human rights framework, maybe you could just talk about your position. What kind of process does the center go through in trying to help with some of these issues? Obviously, you talked about these are very large and powerful governments in a lot of these cases that you're having these issues and these religious freedom problems that are coming up, and how does the center go about trying to help in those situations?
Yeah, our approach is very much one of a multi-faith, multilateral approach. Religious freedom in particular, and human rights in general, are issues that are most effective when they're brought up by lots of people from lots of different backgrounds. It's not just us as Latter-day Saints saying, oh, you're not treating us right? But when we speak out for the Muslims or the Seventh-day Adventists or the Jehovah's Witnesses or the Ahmadiyas, and so we work with people of lots of faiths. We work with people around the world. What we try to do also is this sort of the style of our center is much more, people have classified different types of NGOs and civil society actors. And one type was what they called epistemic communities or knowledge-based communities. And that's very much where we are. So our value added, you could say, is bringing scholarly resources to bear. We'll do analysis of legislation and say, here's the problems with the legislation and where this draft law doesn't meet up with international standards, trying to change it before it's set in stone. Usually, it hits the news after it's already passed and you can't do anything about it. But what we try to do is sort of be there beforehand and to build working relationships where we can, build relationships of trust with governments. So, we're not just here. I mean, there's some groups that are sort of the name and shame variety, and that has a value too. I'm not going to undercut that, but that's not really our role. We try to sort of be honest broker, right? People of goodwill who can work with governments as they're trying to make changes. And they may or may not make all the changes we would like them to make, and we'll be honest about what we think they ought to do. But to be able to work with them and understand where they're coming from and the pressures they're facing, that kind of constructive engagement is a lot more effective than just pointing fingers.
Yeah, I really like that. Obviously, there's a lot of different players in the religious freedom field doing different things. And like you said, I think there's a place for each of those roles to be able to be effective and have.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I guess coming back domestically, maybe, obviously, I think something we've all heard a lot about in the past week is the Supreme Court. There's been a lot that's talked about, obviously, with the passing of Justice Ginsburg and looking forward to the election and to the upcoming Supreme Court term. And the Supreme Court has, in the past year, been a very important player in resolving and trying to better work out a lot of these religious freedom disputes that we've seen, particularly in the United States. What do you see, based on your experience, either looking at the court this last year or just in general, what do you see as within the next 5 to 10 years, issues that we should be paying attention to that are likely to come up before the Supreme Court?
I think you'll see, the hot button issues that you'll see that come up will be more of these sort of tensions between religious freedom and non-discrimination principles, right? Particularly with regards to LGBTQ rights. There's a case that's going to be decided next term about an adoption agency that didn't want to certify lesbian and gay couples for receiving adoption. And so the state said, well, sorry, you can't partner with us. And it was, one of the largest groups, and it was a faith-based group. And so they either had to shut down or sue the state. So they sued the state. And so that's, certainly an issue that's going to come up. Another big issue that is, particularly if there's another conservative justice appointed to the court, is sort of revisiting the framework of the last 20, 30 years of religious freedom. Sort of this test that I explained about balancing and proportionality and compelling state interest is one that was used to be a judicial test. And then in the 1980s, it was dropped and put in by legislation instead. Really complicated story. You'd be glad to know I'm not going to tell you the whole story tonight. But it's a fascinating one. But there's some question about whether that may become a judicial test again. That would expand the scope somewhat, but not enormously. And I think that's one really interesting point in talking about Supreme Court is, people think that that's the only area that religious freedom is happening in. When the truth is, actually, the things that make the most difference for religious freedom are often things that come out of the legislatures. And so a lot of the court cases in the last several years have been interpreting statutory issues having to do with religious rights and LGBTQ rights, say, or religious rights under this legislation that tried to reinstitute the compelling state interest standard as a legislative test. Sorry, that's more legalese than I wanted.
This is great. I think that a lot of this is going to help. I'm hoping that it will help lead a lot of us to do some further research on our own. Obviously, we can't make this into a first year con law First Amendment course, but I think that you've hit on a lot of really important things that people can kind of explore further. I guess talking also about, this legislation, the Supreme Court, kind of these things that we hear a lot about in the media, that's another area that maybe some people are wondering about is how do we best stay informed about these issues and go to sources that are really going to help us to be able to parse through these issues. What types of sources do you go to and how do you kind of keep yourself updated on these issues?
That's an excellent question. Just in this world where you have sort of very polarized media as well as individuals, trying to sort of get an honest scoop is more difficult than you wish sometimes. And I appreciate the question. I think that the resources that your clubs put together are excellent. I really appreciate you doing that. Our center runs a headlines news service where we will, put links to major news from either you can choose from the US or Europe or worldwide. And that's another way to stay informed. I do that. I don't have time to read them all, but I'll at least look through the links and say, oh, that's interesting. This is happening and this is happening. There's also, one of the things that we promote on our things is webinars. That's one of the things I've got to say, there's been a silver lining for me of this whole COVID era is just that being in Provo, Utah, I can now suddenly be part of lots of seminars that are going on in Europe or on the East Coast that, I probably wouldn't have the time to go to otherwise. And so there's a lot of ways like that to stay informed. One other thing, there's someone who taught religion in the media for years and is the longest, Terry Mattingly, he's the longest running syndicated columnist on religion. In fact, that's the name of his column is On Religion. Anyway, he was here for a conference we did once, and I asked him that. I was like, okay, well, how do you know when you're reading an article that this is really going to be reliable, that this is good? Because there's in this kind of field, people bring their biases sometimes to their coverage. And he said, well, look to see if they're interviewing real people and not just quoting documents. Look to see that they're interviewing people on both sides of the spectrum. That if you can get people who will do all of that work to make it a good story, it's more likely to be a well-balanced story and a thoughtful one. So.
That's great advice. And obviously he is definitely an expert in being able to spot those kind of things. So that's a great thing for us to be able to use. We've kind of thus far, we've kind of been taking a lot of issues from, I guess you could say, like a 10,000 foot view, or like, especially like someone who is a lawyer or has to do with the law. And I'm sure that there's several people who are here who have kind of that interest in religious freedom, kind of the legal side of it. But what about obviously there's, like you said, you work with a lot of different people from a lot of different faiths and backgrounds and not necessarily all lawyers. And I guess maybe let's start with your typical BYU student. What do you feel like, if they feel like this is something important, but they're not really sure what to do or how to start or or if they're nervous about having conversations about this, what would be your advice to them? And I guess if they were sitting in your office, came in and asked you, this is something I think is important, what should I do?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think educating yourself is the first step. I know that I felt more comfortable having conversations with people on these topics after I'd sort of learned more when I was in law school, but even before. You don't have to be in law school to do that, to read about it. The church has a whole set of materials that will show up on your Gospel Library app on religious freedom, videos about how to talk to people about these issues, as well as some that have more sort of substantive content. You know, following some of the news sources that you all recommend or that we've got on our headlines. I think, and part of it is not being afraid, because I mean, we live in a really polarized world and politicized world, and it's so unfortunate. And it's so unfortunate that religious freedom has gotten caught up in the crosshairs. I mean, I've got to tell you, 20 years ago when I started working in this field, it just wasn't so. I mean, major religious freedom legislation, the one I was talking about, Change the Standard, was passed almost unanimously in Congress, signed by President Bill Clinton, not an issue, right? But it is now. And that's the reality that you all live in and have experienced. And so because of that, I think some people are hesitant to talk about it, or talk about it in really sort of aggressive, partisan ways that I'm not sure are really helpful. But I think there are ways to engage. I think for models of some of those ways to engage, we do a big annual conference focused on US issues, and one on international issues that are coming up. The international one's coming up in about a week and a half, and the other one's online. And then just sort of watch people talk about this and listen to them, and listen to people from perspectives that you might not agree with, and try and see where you can find common ground. I think that's a big one. I know I've made wonderful friendships since I started this job with people who are LGBTQ advocates. And I think that's been so rewarding for me personally, is to have people who could easily just write me off and say, oh, you're religious freedom, you're one of those nut jobs from the right, you know, but instead are willing to engage and listen and talk. And there's a lot of room for common ground when you look for it. I think that's what I'd say. Sorry, I probably rambled off away from your question. So.
No, I think that was great. There was a lot of great things in there. I guess maybe just one last thing to maybe adjust the question a little bit too. Anything that you feel like in particular Latter-day Saints might have to be able to contribute to this issue, and if so, what would that look like?
Oh, absolutely. I think we are in an enormously blessed position because of the prophetic leadership of the church. On this issue that's so polarizing, there's one state in the United States where there are more LGBTQ protections than any other state, and there are more religious freedom protections. And those came because they were enacted at the same time with the support of church leadership. And this has been known as the Utah Compromise, right? And so in the field that I work in, people from all sides make reference to that. That's something that's a touchstone of, oh, see, look, people actually can get along. Oh, maybe there are ways to work together that are win-win. And so I think I'm grateful for church leadership on this issue. And I think listening carefully to what church leaders have been saying over a long period of time on these issues, and listening carefully, not just sort of assuming that you know what they're going to say, but listening to what they actually do say, it can be a real blessing, and really gives us as Latter-day Saints a unique position in this field to be able to listen with love and work with love for people who otherwise might not talk to each other.
Beautifully said. Thank you. If anyone is interested in learning more about what Professor Clark referenced, the Utah Compromise, that will be actually at our next event. We're going to have someone who is somewhat of a specialist, not even somewhat, he is the specialist on that, talking more about that. But yeah, I think you encapsulated that beautifully, and I think that there is, and that's a big reason why we have this club, is knowing that there is a contribution that we can all make within our spheres, within our own set of religious beliefs and traditions. There's something that we can contribute to this. I'm going to go ahead and turn to questions from people who who are with us viewing, and hopefully I phrase your question in the right way, and that if you have a follow-up, be sure to send that in. But I'll just go in the order that I see them here. The first one talks, well, I'll just address it the way that it's written here. We've seen recently the power of urgent advocacy in raising awareness of important issues such as racial justice and human trafficking. What can we do to create a greater sense of urgency for religious freedom issues?
That's an interesting question and an important one. To some extent, that's just a question of luck almost, right? Having the right timing when something hits that, I think people who are campaigning for racial justice have been campaigning for years and building coalitions and trying to get their message through and feeling like it's not getting through. So part of it is patience, keeping building coalitions, keeping building friendships, trying to get the message out there in civil and thoughtful and thoughtful ways. And then when the moment comes, then you'll have opportunities. But trying to predict when that moment's going to come, it's hard to say. So, but I think it's sort of, like most things in life, right? We do our part and do our preparation, and then just trust that the Lord will help us find the right timing where that preparation can be useful.
That's a great response. Perfect. This next question is from Brinley. Thanks for submitting this. How do you balance your responsibilities in the home with your desire to seriously pursue a career? And I know that this has become very much at the forefront of what you're doing now because so much of your work is at home. So
yes.
How would you respond to that?
My children are very kindly in the background on their electronic devices, not disturbing me. So it's a juggle. I remember being an undergrad and thinking, I really love what I do, and I wanted to, because at that point I was thinking I was going to be an academic, but probably going to study literature, and thinking I want to do this, but I also really care about my family and, future family, right, and the opportunities, and trying to put all those pieces together, and they just didn't fit, and it was because I didn't have all the pieces, and so some of it is just faith and prayer as you go, at least for me, that it's been making individual decisions as I go. I've tried to do the right thing at the right time and be prayerful about it. So for me, that looked differently than it looks for other women. I have colleagues who, they work full-time, and I've worked full-time ever since they finished their law school degree, and I respect them for that. That's been the right thing for them. For me, I worked part-time for a few years when my children were little. I was grateful for a job that let me work from home, and I could still do sort of what I'm doing now, which is, connecting with other people in the world through email and Zoom calls and so forth. So a good question. There isn't an easy answer, but I do know that the Lord has ways to use you, whether it's some combination of being in the home, being vocal and engaged. It's been fun for me now to have been a professor for 20 years and have former students, and to see the whole range of things that they're doing and the amazing people they are. And life has taken them all on really different paths. But I know the Lord's using them, and that he'll find a way to use you.
Yeah, I'll just add to this, Brinley, just so you know, I've had the privilege of being able to work with Professor Clark for a little bit, and I think that I'm not sure, if there's a better example of someone who does make all the efforts to have that balance between family and career responsibilities, and someone who does it very, very well from everything I can tell. So
you never feel like you're doing it well in the moment. So just realize that, and that'll help too.
Good advice. Thank you. The next question says, what are some of the best ways to address problems of hostile attitudes, such as rising anti-Semitism in Europe?
Mm-hmm. It's a big issue here in the United States as well. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia have both increased in the last 4 years or so, dramatically in the United States. That that's a hard one. I think people who've been most effective tend to be individuals who've come out of some of these far-right groups that come from a background where they themselves were highly anti-Semitic or, Islamophobic, and then sort of over time have changed their views, and then can go back and re-engage people and use arguments and discussion that makes sense to them. This is a broader principle that I really like. I don't know if any of you have seen the book by Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, about why good people, what's it called? Why Good People Disagree on Religion and Politics is the subtitle. But he goes through a lot of interesting concepts, but one of them is, how do you influence people on moral issues? And these kinds of issues often are, for people, either deeply moral or deeply ingrained in their sense of identity. And what he found is that in studies of how to influence people's views on, major social taboos or other things, what made more difference than anything was sort of what he calls the elephant theory, right? That an elephant is very hard to move, but if there's another elephant going alongside it, it will follow the first elephant. And the most powerful way to influence other people on moral issues isn't what you might think, particularly as a lawyer, what people might not think, right? It's not just arguing with them. It's building a relationship so that they respect you. And discussions will come and be an inherent part of that. Self-disclosure and being honest about who you are and what you believe is part of building a relationship. But so is listening and trying to understand where they're coming from. And once you have that relationship, the moral judgments change on their own, even without the arguments in many cases. It's fascinating research. You ought to read it. But, it's a good question. There's some things that can be done, also back to your question about anti-Semitism in Europe or elsewhere, that can be done on an educational level, in schools and so forth. But the problem is many people who are highly suspicious of institutions are the ones who are most likely to be anti-Semitic. And so trying to send out institutional messages doesn't always work. Trying to work with groups that they feel more aligned with sometimes is a more effective way.
I really like that. I think that there's so much to gain from that approach that, just the arguing probably misses out on, and a lot of benefits to be had there beyond, trying to have cooperation on these important moral issues. I really like that.
So hard in this polarized world, right? And you hear things and you think, oh, that's so ridiculous. I just need to argue with you because you are so clearly wrong. And sometimes things need to be said, but I think it's really helpful to know that that's not the thing that in the end is going to push people's views one way or another.
Right, that's not going to move the elephant.
Yeah.
This next question is somewhat related to the last one. Just looking at the world, some severe abuses of religious freedom, especially for our day and age. This question cites human rights abuses of the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, and like you talked about, the Uyghur Muslims in China. And the question is essentially, why is it so hard to intervene and try and help ameliorate these issues? Is it an issue of greater international cooperation, or are there other things that make this difficult?
A lot of it has to do with the tractability of the governments involved. How amenable are they to various forms of diplomacy or pressure of one sort or another? And China's a very powerful country. And so a lot of countries that are smaller don't want to get involved and don't want to speak up because they would jeopardize their relationship with China, which is too valuable for them economically. And so, sometimes it really does depend on countries like the United States that are large that can engage. But even the United States, it's a challenge trying to raise human rights issues in China. It's been an issue, under all administrations, trying to figure out how much carrot and stick do you give? How much do you engage people philosophically? In Myanmar, it's a similar issue, although on a smaller scale. The government just has been so isolated for so long that it hasn't really cared what the outside world has thought. And there's still a fair amount of that going on. There's more venues for international diplomacy, international cooperation. There's interesting, some work that's been done on different types of NGO communities I mentioned, and how there's the name and shame types and the epistemic types, and then there's the types that focus on reporting. I mean, there's a number of different types, and there's roles for all of them. And in some of the most heinous cases, that's where sometimes some of the name and shame thing is most useful. But like other diplomatic issues, it has its challenges. So I'm not sure I can give you a good answer to that.
Well, I think that's a pretty big question to ask for a complete and certain answer on. So, but I think that's, like you said, I think there's a lot of it has to do with the government context that surrounds those countries, and the tractability issue definitely is a part of that. So I think this will probably be our last, well, I'll say second to last question. I'll take the prerogative of the very last question. But this question here, it gets back to the US specifically, and asking about, do you think the Lemon v. Kurtzman test adequately protects religious freedom in the US? And so for those of you who aren't familiar, and Professor Clark can explain this, but we talked about a test that was used for religious freedom in the Supreme Court that's, like Professor Clark was saying, that became part of, it was not used in the courts, and then it was used in legislation, and there's still some tension around that. But prior to that, there was another test that was in use known as the Lemon test. And the question here is whether you feel like that would adequately protect religious freedom.
Justice Scalia once described the Lemon test. The Lemon test has to do with sort of when is there an establishment of religion, right? If you know the First Amendment in the United States, part of it is free exercise, that you should be able to worship or act out your belief freely. And the other half is forbidding government establishment of religion. And what does that mean? That's one that no one has ever come up with a really good, long-lasting definition of. Lemon is sort of the default definition, but there's other sort of quasi-definitions that get used in smaller areas of the law. And Justice Scalia once called Lemon as a ghoul that will never be put to rest, because it pops up, but people interpret it differently. Essentially, the idea is that when is it an establishment? It's establishment if there's no secular purpose to the government's activity, if it has a unfair impact either for or against religion, or if it gets government too entangled in religion. What does this mean? Well, nobody really knows. It's been applied differently over time, applied differently in different contexts. I was on the phone today with a reporter, sorry, I'm doing this on my phone, from USA Today, who was trying to figure it out. I was trying to explain to him, he was trying to figure out whether, some activity happening on a public university campus in Texas is problematic or not. I'm trying to give him some context on that. So it's the Supreme Court in the last 20 years or so has backed away from some of the prongs of it, because some of the prongs of it seemed a little weird, right? The government can't protect religion, even though it has a First Amendment requirement to, that everything it does has to be neutral, both in favor of and against religion. So that's been sort of problematic. The question of entanglement, what does entanglement mean? There's all these court cases about if the government provides supplies or specialists or disability assistance for religious schools, elementary and secondary schools, is that excessive entanglement? Is it not excessive entanglement? It was this famous case in New York where they basically sort of got rid of all the state support for disability students who went to private religious schools. And then they basically opened the same case up 20 years later and said, oh, you know, we actually got that wrong. Let's reverse the case. And both times they're applying Lemon test. And so, yeah, it's sort of anyone's guess. The Establishment Clause is a mess. So, yeah, you should all go into law and solve the problem.
Great. Well, I once again just want to thank you, Professor Clark, for generously giving of your time to be able to share your thoughts, your expertise, your insights on these issues. And I guess I would want to finish. I've done a lot of the asking the questions, guiding the discussion. Is there anything that you want to share or express as we finish?
You know, I'm just thrilled that you all are here, that there are students who are interested in these issues. I'm impressed with all of you and just really thrilled that there is this kind of engagement. I think they're important issues where people need to be thoughtful and have a voice. And so I take my hat off to you.
Thank you. I guess virtual applause through Zoom from everyone. It's an interesting format. Professor Clark, thank you so much. We are so grateful. Just such a blessing to even have you here at BYU, and to be able to have you here in our event is truly a treat. So thank you so much.